Սիրելի բարեկամներ, անցյալ շաբաթ Նյու Ջերսիի Hackensack բժշկական համալիրի Hekimian սրահում տեղի ունեցավ Հայ օգնության միության Ամերիկայի արևելյան շրջանի համաժողով սեմինարը։ Այժմ ձեր ուշադրությանն եմ ներկայացնում մեր պատրաստած ակնարկը այդ մասին։
Recently at the Hackensack University Medical Center at the Hekimian Auditorium took place an ARS, Armenian Relief Society of Eastern USA regional seminar. The seminar began with members of this over a century-old organization singing the organization's anthem. Masters of Ceremony of the seminar, Marianne Bonjukian, welcomed the attendees and Keruhinesh, and invited ARS of Eastern USA chairperson Caroline Shamavonian for opening remarks. And Keruhi Shamavonian spoke about the work organization has done since its last seminar in Boston 4 years ago, including providing humanitarian relief to Armenians in Lebanon, Artsakh, and Armenia, supporting Armenian soldiers, as well as continuing the programs in the US by providing scholarship to students, supporting the elderly during the pandemic, and much more. She also reported that the organization continues to grow, including new chapters in Vermont and Manhattan.
Dear CB member, Angerik Silva Kuyumjian, Regional Board, honored guests, ARS members, and friends of ARS. It is my great honor to welcome you all to New Jersey for the Armenian Relief Society of Eastern USA Regional Seminar. My special thanks to New Jersey chapters, Agnuni, Bergen County Armenuhi, and Shake chapters for hosting the seminar. The last time we held an in-person regional seminar was in 2019 in Boston, Massachusetts. Over 4 years have passed since that weekend in Boston. So much has happened in our communities, in our homeland, in the Armenian diaspora, and even in the world. We began 2020 with our region preparing to celebrate ARS 110th anniversary. Instead, the year was filled with hardship, loss, tragedies. We all felt the impact of COVID-19, and all plans were either canceled or put on hold. Followed by Beirut port explosion, along with economic conditions in Lebanon. We tried to understand the agony that our compatriots in Lebanon felt and tried to help them to ease their pain. The war was at the doorsteps of our homeland. We felt the threat facing our nation. However, all these hardships and challenges didn't stop our region and our members. We jumped into action and continued our humanitarian mission. Our chapters, members, and communities responded to our calls, and we were able to provide urgent support for those who needed our help. At the same time, we continued our programs in the United States and provided thousands of dollars worth of scholarships to young scholars. Our chapters worked in their community during the pandemic to support the elderly and thanked our medical heroes. We extended our healing hands to our community members in Lebanon before and after the port explosion. We supported the work of the Central Executive Board in Artsakh, supported our soldiers, families, and supported the work of our sister region in Syria as devastating earthquake hit the region just recently. Throughout these difficult times, still we continued to grow. We've established 3 new chapters, 90 chapter in North Carolina, new chapter in Vermont, and I'm glad to say that Vermont chapter members are here. Can we see Vermont chapter? And Ziran chapter in Manhattan in New York. Also Ziran chapter members. And chapters continued to recruit new members who committed to work hand in hand with us to help those that needed our assistance. As Armenian Relief Society members, we are proud to be guided by our core values of compassion, integrity, and service.
The keynote speaker of the seminar was Cynthia Ruggerio, an alumni of the Masters of Arts and Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Stockton, and a practicing lawyer. In her wide-ranging speech accompanied by PowerPoint presentation and videos, Cynthia Ruggerio focused on cultural destruction as a key aspect of impending or ongoing genocide. She drew parallel patterns of cultural destruction seen in Ottoman Empire in 1915 and in Azerbaijan-controlled territory of Artsakh today. In both cases, the precursor of the genocide were the destruction and erasure of the Armenian cultural and historical monuments. She also addressed the current European Union and the U.S. political stance on this topic.
Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jew whose family was murdered during the Holocaust, and he knew of and was influenced by the Armenian genocide. He was a legal scholar, and he developed the term and concept genocide after World War II, and he was instrumental in having the United Nations pass the genocide law, or the crime of genocide as it exists today. As you see from Lemkin's words on the screen here, genocide is not just a plan to commit mass murder, it's a plan to erase a group of people and their culture from the face of the earth. He says here, the objective of the plan is the destruction of culture. Importantly, this aspect of genocide was not incorporated into the 1948 law. The law doesn't address cultural destruction. And so patterns of cultural destruction that suggest impending genocide are not responded to through the law, and this matters, as we'll see. Another way to look at this is as stated by Umit Kurt, who's a Kurdish genocide scholar, and published a recent, what we call a micro-study on Aintab. Kurt says genocide is a process not only of destruction, but also of construction. By the time genocide perpetrators are destroying one group, they're also constructing another group or identity. So in 1915 and following years, after the Committee of Union and Progress tried to erase Armenian identity, both physically and symbolically, from indigenous lands, they simultaneously defined a new identity for themselves as modern-day Turkey. Kurt's book documents how this was done in Aintab specifically, accounting for how Armenian homes were taken over by Turks, and the theft of Armenian money, and identifying Turks who stepped into Aintab Armenian businesses that had previously existed. We see a similar process in Nakhichevan and Artsakh, traditional Armenian lands, violence to move Armenians off the land, and attempts to stamp out all traces of their presence. Some forms of cultural destruction during genocide include the destruction of churches, elimination of victim group literature and art, disintegration of language, in this case Western Armenian, and murder of cultural leaders in various fields. And we hear scholars talk about intergenerational effects from genocide. Cultural destruction carries with it its own brand of intergenerational effects. Not only do survivors have to deal with losing loved ones, but they have to endure the deep fear that their traditions will be lost, family traditions and community traditions. And from generation to generation, families of survivors work to rebuild their culture and to hold on to these traditions. This is a big part of the Stockton exhibit that was mentioned, the Armenian genocide, one family story also. So what are all these points, general points, on cultural destruction getting at? First, that cultural destruction is a warning or red flag that mass atrocity or genocide will follow. Second, that it's part of genocide. It reflects a genocidal ideology, and when perpetrators destroy a church, for example, they say to the world, we are destroying the unwanted other, and we want to eliminate them. Cultural destruction also facilitates denial. Denialist narratives depend in part on continued cultural destruction long after mass murder is over.
In her presentation, she showed clips from 1919 Action of the Souls, based on our Martiganian testimony, and cellist Seva Gavanesian playing in a church in Shushi, connecting the two as the continuation of the same politics of genocide.
So this is an amalgam of video clips from the 1919 movie Auction of Souls, based on Aurora Mardiganian's testimony as an Armenian genocide survivor, and the 2020 bombing of the Shushi Cathedral in Artsakh. In the Artsakh portion, we see cellist Sevak Avanatzian playing Kronk Gvaigomidas in the bombed-out cathedral. As you see in the Aurora Mardiganian part, during the Armenian genocide, churches were routinely burned with Armenians in them. This was physical and cultural destruction in one ultra-violent act. And this technique, if you want to call it that, or tactic, was adopted by the Nazis during the Holocaust also, particularly with regard to synagogues in Eastern Europe, which were typically made of wood. Similar to the Auction of Souls scene, this is the Sirp Garabed Monastery in Mush. This is seen in our exhibit also. As CUP forces cleared out town after town in 1915 and later years, they destroyed churches and monasteries in their path with gunfire, bombs, and through other means. Between Mush and Van alone, 30 monasteries were leveled in a series of weeks, according to records. And we know that the Armenian Patriarch in Constantinople maintained records of churches before the genocide. Prior to the genocide, there were 2,538 Armenian churches in the Ottoman Empire, according to church records. By 1974, based on a British study, there were only 913 churches and monastic sites in the region. And now it's estimated that there are 38 functioning churches today. And I put functioning in quotes because I'm not sure what that's some ANCA information, and I'm not sure what they consider functioning, whether they're functioning all the time or whether they just have certain events, et cetera, which is important. So in addition to just leveling or razing churches, we also need to recognize that destruction includes desecration or purposeful inaction to allow churches to crumble with time. Pictured here are the remains of two churches in Ani, St. Gregory of Tigran-Honense, and the Church of the Holy Redeemer. In 1921, Ani was ransacked by Kemal Ataturk's forces as they pushed eastward. Ataturk ordered Turkish forces to ensure that, quote, every single stone of Ani was to be abolished from the face of the earth, close quote. These comments reflect genocidal intent to destroy or annihilate. But turning to Nakhichevan, this is the monastery of St. Tomba in Aglis. St. Tomba was a significant religious center in medieval Armenia and was in good condition in the early 1980s. By 2000, satellite imagery shows the monastery being dismantled, and in 2009, it was destroyed. It was ultimately replaced with the mosque that you see on the right. A group called Cultural Heritage Watch, made up of scholars from Cornell, Purdue, and other schools, issued a report on the Azeri erasure of Armenian churches just last year. The report's based on comparing indisputable satellite imagery with primary source photos that were taken by Argam Ivatsian, dating back to the 1960s and ranging up through the 80s. Ivatsian grew up in Nakhichevan before Armenians were forced to flee and spent years photographing churches and kachkars in the region. And so the results of the CHW report, which as I said is relatively, it's pretty recent, is that between 1997 and 2001, 108 Armenian sites were totally obliterated. This is 98% of the Armenian cultural heritage in Nakhichevan. This bears a striking resemblance to what happened in the Ottoman Empire. And when we think about this, a 98% rate of destruction in that short amount of time, and we see the video with the bombing of the Shushi Cathedral in Artsakh, we have to have serious concerns about the same thing happening there. CHW says on this, silent and systematic erasure has been a feature of Azerbaijan's domestic ethnic policies. The second resonating pattern is denialism after destruction. Many of you are familiar with the Azerbaijan narrative on the destruction of the Hulfa cemetery. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the government of Azerbaijan destroyed thousands of Khachkars that once stood in the cemetery. And the Azeris have embraced an unabashed denialist narrative on Hulfa that includes comments and actions like the following. In 2005, a Scottish researcher who went to look at Hulfa was told there were no Armenians ever here by Azeri police. In 2006, Ilham Aliyev described charges of destruction as, quote, absolutely false and slanderous information from the Armenian lobby, similar to the quote up on the screen. The Azerbaijan government has also embraced a false narrative that the leveled Armenian churches in Nakhichevan were actually built by Caucasian Albanians and not Armenians. Turkey also obviously has a denialist narrative and actually has institutionalized denialism, as we know. They work in what you might call a more sophisticated or nuanced way at this point. For churches that once stood in or around 1915, the Turkish government doesn't have to say anything because they've been long gone, or there are other structures that have stood in their place for decades. For example, in Ayantep, which we looked at previously, the Armenian church there was a restaurant and is now a mosque. In Kayseri, which is where one of his grandmothers was from, the church houses a community center. But for major heritage sites like Ani, which we see again, the eyes of the world are on Turkey, and so they have organizations watching, like the World Monuments Fund, and they take a more nuanced approach. This photo shows how the Armenian writing inside the Church of St. Gregory has been whitewashed on the right-hand side. So turning to the genocide law, genocide is the commission of murder and certain other acts with the intent to destroy an ethnic, religious, racial, or national group in whole or in part. These are all legal components. They all require proof of almost every word in the law as a whole. But one of the important points is one of the acts that can be prosecuted under the law is inflicting conditions of life calculated to physically destroy the group. And because of this language, genocide scholars and others have stepped up to assert that the situation with the blockade is genocide right now, or is exceedingly close. One group, the Lemkin Institute, has issued a series of statements. One is that forcing people to leave their land on the threat of death is a form of genocide. And this harkens back to that language I was just talking about depriving conditions of life as being an act that can be prosecuted under the law. The Lemkin Institute also says Azerbaijan is committing slow genocide, or genocide by 1,000 cuts, with the support of Turkey. And Western powers have to recognize what they've done in dealing with Aliyev and Erdogan. This is calling out the EU deal, not as powerfully as Claire Daly, but pretty powerfully, and also calling for immediate action to protect Armenian lands. Similarly, the International Association of Genocide Scholars has said the government of Azerbaijan, encouraged by its ally Turkey, has long promoted official hatred of Armenians and has fostered impunity for atrocities committed against Armenians. They've also called for active intervention. Genocide Watch and Amnesty International have also issued statements. And all of this activity by scholars and interest groups is helpful to put more pressure on the US government and others. So what can, when you think about all of these things, what can the US do now? They can take action as a member of this permanent member of the UN Security Council pursuant to the genocide law or the Rome Statute. They can more easily, much more easily, cut military assistance to Azerbaijan, which comes through a waiver that's part of an anti-terror law that was passed in 2002 after the World Trade Center. This can be done just by the executive branch, i.e. Joe Biden, and this is part of the reason why the ANCA issued its statement in response to Joe Biden's statement on April 24th this year, saying, "We appreciate your statement recognizing the genocide, but you can cut aid to Azerbaijan, and you need to do this now." And so more pressure needs to be put on the president to make that happen. The other things that can be done are UN sanctions against Turkey. It would be better if it was the United Nations together, but if not possible, the United States could impose sanctions and other countries, France perhaps. And then other issues would be supporting the International Court of Justice more vocally, pushing for international recognition of ARTSOC, which Adam Schiff and others in Congress are doing right now. And stop putting the political agenda with Russia and the Ukraine above everything else that's going on in the world.
Her presentation concluded with an informative Q&A. The next keynote speaker of the seminar was Kim Hekimian, an assistant professor of nutrition and pediatrics at the Institute of Human Nutrition at Columbia University Medical Center, who also works extensively in Armenia as a faculty member at the American University and serves as an advisor to the Armenian Ministry of Health. Using data and PowerPoint presentation, she spoke about several important health challenges facing women in Armenia today, including the importance of breastfeeding, malnutrition in children and newborns, maternity care, and much more.
So let's start with infancy. I'm not going to speak much more about this than the fact that I did spend a lot of time to promote exclusive breastfeeding as a means of reducing death by infections for infants. So in the early 1990s, on this side you see this is the deaths per 1,000 live births. So Armenia was experiencing somewhere around 30 to 35 deaths of infants per 1,000 live births. And many of the deaths were occurring from infants having an infection of either, an acute respiratory infection, right, or from diarrheal infections, from diarrheal disease. And at the time that I sort of landed in Armenia to do my dissertation work, a lot of infant formula was coming in, had started coming in after the earthquake, and the Ministry of Health was asking for like 1,000 metric tons of formula for a population of less than 3 million people. And it seemed like, why? People were asking me from the USAID side, they were like, why don't women breastfeed? I thought it was a traditional society for breastfeeding. So, we know from international research that particularly in areas where there's economic compromise, poor quality water, and poor health services, that breastfed children have at least 6 times greater chance of survival in the early months than non-breastfed children, and that breastfeeding drastically reduces death from acute respiratory infection and diarrhea. And these were the infections that were killing a lot of infants at the time. So I thought, I was looking for a project, and I was like, I'll dip into this project. I was working at the American University of Armenia. We got a huge funding from both the United States Agency for International Development and UNICEF. And basically, these were the kinds of questions that we wanted to know, right? Like, are Armenian women breastfeeding? If not, why not? Are they using infant formula? Why? When do they start? What happens immediately after delivery? Are they supported in the hospital for breastfeeding? How are they receiving formula? What do they do if their children are sick? Do they go to a healthcare provider, and what happens at the healthcare provider visit? Basically, I was asking moms, why this desperate need for infant formula? And they say, got this anbavararer, got chiga, yerechas latzer linum. So these are the kinds of things that women say right here in the United States or any country that we go around the world. It's really hard to know if your infant's getting enough nutrition, enough milk, because we can't see it, right? And with anxiety, with all this infant formula coming in after the earthquake, a lot of women thought, well, if the Americans are sending it, it's probably better than our own breast milk, and they started to use it. So we did this data and created these policy revisions and did training of healthcare providers and social marketing. We created this brochure here that we gave out to every mom who delivered an infant. At that time, there were 44,000 births a year. Now we're down to 36,000. We did see a great improvement in breastfeeding rates in Armenia. Not as high as we wanted, but we did see significant improvement. I just want to talk for a minute about what we call chronic undernutrition for children. In Armenia, many, for those of you who've been there and spent a lot of time there, you see that, right? So the thing is that by eating cheese and bread and potatoes, you can have a child who has sufficient calories for sure, and they're gaining weight and they're, tumbelik, and they look, sort of even rosy, healthy. But without the proper proteins and amino acids, zinc, and so on, without proper nutrition during this phase, there's a phenomenon called stunted growth, which doesn't happen in the United States because almost everything we give to kids in the United States it's fortified with some of these essential nutrients, not because our kids are eating whole foods, they're still eating junk, but that junk happens to have a spray on it of fortification. So one could argue that that's good or bad, but in terms of this issue, it's actually helpful. So there's no fortification of any of the bread or foods in Armenia. So what I'm concerned about, and one of the things I'm really interested in, is this, that we call it the intergenerational consequences of undernutrition. And so if we have a pregnant woman who's undernourished, she's going to have a baby who's undernourished. And if that baby continues to not receive the proper nutrition, that child might become stunted. I'm going to talk about what that means. It's low height for age. And then a stunted child can become an adolescent that's stunted, gets married, and this cycle can continue. The good news is that you can intervene anywhere in this circle and change that cycle for the next generation. Our fertility rate is a problem. We do not have enough children to even replace our population. So we are losing population, and that will continue to happen. This is what's anticipated to happen as we move forward. So our current fertility rate, it was 2.6, like the average number of children per family, 2.6 in 1990. In 2017, it was 1.6, and it's expected to just continue to decrease. It's expensive to have children. It's difficult to have children. The economy doesn't really support having more than one or two children. And that's going to continue to be an issue for us in our national security, because we really are not going to have enough people to staff our army. Abortion rates have gone down. This is another good story, right? Infant mortality has come down, maternal mortality has come down, and abortion rates have come down, but all of those are still high and could be better. So in Armenia, the unintended pregnancy rate declined by 75%, but during the same period, the abortion rate also declined. So the share of unintended pregnancies ending in abortion are about 82%. What does that mean? About 50% of births are unintended. About 50% of pregnancies are unintended. That's true here as well in the United States. But whereas about 12% of the United States unintended pregnancies result in abortion, here we have 82%, right? So these are our abortion rates per 1,000 women. The average woman in Armenia has 2.6 abortions in her given lifetime. Now, rather than being judgmental about that, what we really need to do is think about why. And that's because this was the only form of abortion that was provided to generations of women. And don't forget that the role of the church was really diminished. So there was really no ever discussion of life and when life begins and so on. That is beginning to change. And as I said, other contraceptives are now available, and women can insert an IUD, for example, or take the pill or other things. This for me is a huge issue. This is something that I'm actually working on now I'm an advisor to the Ministry of Health, and so I've taken on like a few projects for them. This was the policy change I was talking about in 2008, where they made everything free, and they had to raise the salaries of the doctors to be able to do that, and they created a new finance reform mechanism where C-section births were reimbursed to the hospital at a higher rate than a vaginal birth. And that's because there's a lot more going on. There's anesthesia, there's a skill set there's longer length of stay. It wasn't an illogical thing to do, but it led to this rapid increase in C-section rates now. And in some hospitals in Armenia, over 50% of all births are done through cesarean section. And it's worth it to the doctor. They convince the women that, this is going to be easier for you. You don't have to go through labor pain. It'll be quicker, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, once you've had your first birth has been through C-section, your second birth is going to be through C-section. And so we're seeing a little bit of the mathematics of this. I still don't have the data divided out by like first C-section versus second C-section. So this is something to be considered. My last thoughts are that health security is a significant part of national security. Mental health is extremely important. Somebody brought it up here. And grief is a determinant of health. And Armenia is undergoing national grief. And that national grief is making them sick. And this is something that, again, only the diaspora can really keep moving forward. I'm really pleased, again, though, that the Hayastansis have really turned a page and saying that, yes, I need help. But there's not a lot of help there. Change at the community level only comes when the community is at the decision-making table. I'm facing this time and time again. The Ministry of Health or the Mars Bedaran, they think that if they just put out like a proclamation or a protocol, that the change is going to happen down at the community level, and that's just not the case. And I feel bad that I'm sitting at this very high level, and I want to go back into the community. I want to hear things from the patient's perspective. I want to make change that is relevant to the patient, not just relevant to the policymakers. Cultural competence is this concept that we understand the culture within which we're working in global health. And cultural humility is the idea that our culture's not better. And it's really hard to do those two things. But I have learned over my decades of working in Armenia that I have to stop judging. I have to ask why something is happening and understand it from their perspective, and then see if I can help from my perspective and outside perspective by offering an alternative opinion.
Valentina Berberian, ARS UN Chair, invited the former ARS UN interns representing the next generation. Each took turns reading a paragraph of the history of Armenian women from ancient times to Ottoman Turkey to Soviet era and to modern independent Armenia today.
So the first talk is going to be Talin Nikdelian, followed by Nori Boyajian, Talar Hovsepian, then Arev Ebrimian, and I'll conclude about my part, which will be Armenian women in modern time and evolution.
Armenian women in ancient times. Armenian women have played a vital role in the history of Armenia. Some of the most famous women in Armenian history include Queen Zabel I, first of Armenia, the Kingdom of Armenia from 1199 to 1252. Queen Tamar ruled the Kingdom of Georgia from 1184 to 1213. Queen Catherine ruled the Kingdom of Georgia from 1465 to 1476, and Queen Ketevan ruled the Kingdom of Georgia from 1605 to 1624. The wives of kings also played a vital role in Armenian courts. They were called the Armenian Lady. In the epic tale of Daredevils of Sasun, Sasna Zerer, Armenian female characters are described as courageous women who are independent in making their own choices in life. The Armenian ancient goddesses were Anahit, Asrik, and Nane. They played a significant role in pagan mythology. Moreover, Anahit was one of the main goddesses, the daughter of Aramast. Earlier, Anahit was the goddess of war, indirectly proving that during the early period of slavery, Armenian women took part in military operations. Later, the goddess was given a more feminine role, becoming the goddess of fertility and childbirth.
Since the 4th century, the equality of women and men's rights were constantly emphasized in ancient Armenian legal documents. In the Middle Ages, Armenian law was based on ecclesiastical rules related to the Christian Church. Equality between men and women was mentioned in the rules of Ashtishat, 4th century, and the traditions of Shahapivan, 5th century, where a woman should manage a family property in case her husband leaves her. According to medieval documents, Armenian women were entitled to own property which they could donate, sell, or bequeath without consulting their husbands. The first Armenian book of law was written by monk Mkhitar Gosh. He specified that men and women have equal rights and are equally responsible for the family welfare. Educated women are a treasure for society, wrote Mkhitar Gosh. Men and women were free in their spheres of activities, men as providers and protectors, and women as household and family organizers and transmitters of customs, traditions, moral values, and national aspirations. However, at the beginning of the 19th century, things worsened under the Russian and Ottoman Empire, with few prospects for women becoming less than potential and actual mothers. Armenia was one of the first states to globally give women the right to vote. The First Republic of Armenia, 1918 to 1920, was of the first countries to give women the right to vote and to be elected in public institutions. In the National Assembly of First Republic, 8% of deputies were women. In 1920, Diana Apgar appointed Armenia's ambassador to Japan. After her appointment, Japan de facto recognized the Republic of Armenia, facilitating her humanitarian activities and assistance to refugees.
Women's role in Armenian traditional family. In traditional Armenian families, women were responsible for the domestic sphere, including caring for children, cooking, and cleaning. They were also responsible for spinning wool and weaving cloth. Women generally did not participate in public life. Their primary role was maintaining the home and supporting their husbands. In some families, women had more freedom and could participate in more public activities, but this was not the norm. Men were expected to take care of the family financially. Over the course of years, Armenians have migrated to countries with democratic societies, consequently being exposed to the presence of gender equality. Exposure to different kinds of societies slowly steered away from the patriarchal society, which prioritizes men. In some instances, for socioeconomic reasons, Armenian women had to work and help financially for the household's well-being. They were faced with a double burden in which they were expected to take care of the household and step into the workforce. Social activism and education of Armenian women. During Ottoman rule, Armenian men and women no longer had equal rights, contrary to what was stated in the first Armenian book of law. Girls were not taught to read. Their education consisted only of religious precepts. They were expected to marry soon after puberty and become the symbol of obedience to the patriarch and the husband's extended family members. Quote, "Only motherhood had a liberating effect on women, and maternal love purified her heart, gave her authority in the family and the incentive to sacrifice personal advantage for the greater value of family." Since teaching was one of the few occupations in the Ottoman Empire open to women, Armenian women made the most of this opportunity by spreading ethnic culture and the Armenian language as a potent symbol of national unity. Literary figures such as Sepuhi Dusab, Sibyl, and Zabel Yesayan raised funds and established girls' schools in remote provinces of Western Armenia to arouse awareness of the shared history. These pioneer women created the Declaration of Armenian Women's Rights. The Declaration's provisions were about equal rights for men and women, the right to choose a profession, and the abolition of double standards of morality, which men in marriage used. The right to higher education as a means of improving a child's upbringing, the right for women to equal participation in community activities. This declaration, in fact, carried the ideology of ensuring the financial independence of women. The emergence of this kind of declaration in Muslim Turkey was indeed revolutionary. Armenians were the first to raise the role of women in public life consciously.
Armenian women in Soviet times and modern evolution. During the Soviet era, equal rights for men and women in work, educational, social, and economic life were declared. The state guaranteed free and obligatory school education, free and accessible university education, free medical services, paid 24 days of vacation, paid prenatal and postnatal vacation. In 1920, the right to abortion was legalized and medical care in this field guaranteed. Despite these advances, a woman in Soviet Armenia carried a double load and faced structural discrimination. The role of women in political life was only formal. There have never been women in the Communist Party elite. In the new independent Republic of Armenia, women and men enjoy equal rights in political life, work, and family. On the eve of independence, the Supreme Council of Armenia in 1990, there were 260 deputies, 11 of them were women. The transition to democracy and a free market economy caused the deterioration of the status of Armenian women in society. According to Social Rights Watch, many bodies were created to assist women. In the framework of the Beijing Action Plan implementation, in 1997, a committee was created to carry out the Gender Policy Development Program, which was designed to improve the status of women, but was never implemented due to a lack of financing. The most important achievement was the approval of the 2004-2010 Republic of Armenia National Action Plan on improving the status of women by the decree number N645, dated April 8, 2004. The sections of the action plan were equal rights and opportunities for women and men in decision-making, to improve the social and economic condition of women, the right to women to education and research, to improve the health condition of women, to eliminate violence against women, and the role of mass media and cultural institutions in reporting on women's issues. Some points, like the advance in research and the elimination of violence against women and the gathering of statistical data, were implemented, but still the program remained unaccomplished due to the absence of accountability mechanism for implementation. On a positive note, in 2022, Armenia recently adopted a National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, which the government had approved in the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, that called on all states to end impunity and prosecute all crimes, including violence against women and girls. In the last parliamentary election, the representation of women was 34%. In 2022, a woman governor and a woman prosecutor were elected in Armenia for the first time. Thank you.
Seta Agamians spoke about the ARS parliamentary procedures for a proper member meeting for the organization. She spoke about the importance of resolutions, bylaws, active chapters and active members, the role of observers, and much more. Founded in 1910, the Armenian Relief Society, ARS, is an independent, non-governmental philanthropic organization serving the humanitarian, social, and educational needs of Armenians around the world for the 113 years and counting. ARS has entities in 27 countries. For the 113 years, women of ARS, one generation after the other, are helping Armenians in need across the globe. They are driven by the organization's core mission, which is to serve the humanitarian needs of all communities that may require emergency aid, promote the educational, social, health, and welfare of the communities, and to preserve the cultural identity of Armenian people worldwide.